Hello everybody, welcome back to a new tutorial video. It's been a while, I know, but I'm back into making actual tutorials again. And today I'm experimenting a little bit with the format. I'm trying out some new things, see if they work, if you guys like them. If they do, leave a like, that way I can tell that you guys really enjoyed the kind of content that I'm producing now. As I said, there's no major changes. It's still going to be music production and mainly technical stuff. For example, today we're going to talk about stereo information and everything stereo. But for example, I'm using a few different techniques to try to illustrate what I'm talking about and a few new different ways of editing as well. So yeah, if you enjoy that kind of thing, subscribe, like, and comment on the video. That way I know if you guys engage with the video that you guys like it. If you really like it, consider sharing it with a friend. And without further ado, let's get into the actual video. So we're going to talk about stereo today. Now there are two definitions of stereo, which I'm both going to give. I'm going to show some examples of what that means, both definitions. And then we'll also talk a little bit about the differences that those definitions imply. And then we'll talk a little bit more about the advanced stuff, really generating stereo, controlling stereo, working with stereo in sound design and that kind of stuff. But for now, we'll talk about the definition first. So the most basic definition of a stereo signal is a signal with two components. So that would be a component for your left ear and a component for your right ear. The reason we chose two components is because we have two ears. Mainly when you're wearing headphones, for example, what you'll have is you will have one signal going to your left ear and the other signal going to your right ear. And together they form stereo signal that you can hear. This means that one signal goes into the left ear and the other one goes into the right ear. So here we have a right ear signal and here we have a left ear signal. So the second definition of stereo has to do with speaker systems. You might have heard of a stereo speaker system. What that means is that you have two speakers. Usually one stands on the left side of your desk and the other on the right side of your desk, and you're kind of facing in between them. So one is more towards the left ear and the other is more towards the right ear. You can see the differences between these two definitions when you look at what's happening from above. So with the second definition, you obviously have the left speaker going to your left ear and the right speaker going to your right ear. But also a little bit of your sound is kind of moving from one point around your head and basically goes from the right speaker to the left ear and from the left speaker to the right ear. So this is the kind of stuff that you don't have when you talk about that first definition, where we just have a left speaker going into a left ear and a right speaker going into a right ear, right there. So I mentioned signals, but I have not explained yet what they are and what we mean by signals. So I'm quickly going to show you what I mean by them, both on the whiteboard as well as in the DAW. When you have a speaker, what it's doing is it's basically a cone like this, which is vibrating with a magnet, which sits in the middle, which is electric current is applied and then it goes back and forth. And what happens is you kind of get pressure here. So let's say pressure is happening here and that's going outward to whatever is in front of it. What we're mainly interested in is ears because we're listening to it. So this pressure goes outward. So what we can do is we can basically say, let's take a point right here at the start of the speaker and just kind of measure the pressure, what it's doing. So let's say we plot that in a graph. So we'll have pressure here and then we'll have time here. And let's just say the pressure point right here is 0, which will mean the normal pressure is if the speaker is not doing anything. So what the speaker can do, it can go forward and then it's represented by an increase in pressure going up like that. But it can also go backward, which means that the pressure is going down. So you can kind of plot over time what the pressure is doing and then you can kind of get a signal. So this is what you see when you open up your DAW, you see this exact signal. It's basically the pressure over time or the position of the speaker comb over time. So here what you can see is we have this sine wave going up and down. You can see we have a left channel here and a right channel here. You can see the 0 line right there and you can see how it goes above to 1 and then goes to -1 here. And there's no line here, but you can definitely see that they're at the very minimum and this one is at the very maximum, where here it's at the very minimum and this one is also at the very maximum there. So you can see it's two sine waves oscillating. Now when we look at digital audio, what is happening is we have a signal coming into a microphone which is the opposite of a speaker. So it will record the pressure and then it will take that recording and turn it into a signal, whereas a speaker takes a signal and turns it into pressure in the air. And it basically, let's say it captures this signal, just a nice sine wave with the time axis right in the middle, and this being the pressure axis. What we'll say is, let's call this the maximum pressure that the microphone can handle, 1, and the minimum value that it can handle, -1. And then right here in the middle where it's silent, where nothing is happening, we'll call that 0. What we can do to turn this into an actual digital sample that you can store on basically any device, on any memory, we can take that and just make a measurement of where this signal is at certain points in time. So we'll do a little interval. We'll start here, and then we'll go 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 here, like that. And we can just make a whole bunch of measurements throughout the signal, and then we just store the values of those measurements one after the other into an audio file, which is really what an audio file is. It's just a bunch of numbers representing what this signal is doing through measurements. So now let's actually look at the digital part of this. So if we really zoom in on these signals, what you can see is you can see these points. Now these are the actual measurements points used to create this signal. So you can see the individual points of measurement that make up this digital signal. And when you look at the file, what you'll see is you will see all the values for these individual points going from, as you can see, 0 here, going up, increasing, decreasing again, going negatively, and then going back up again, like that. So from this point on in the video, I want to warn you that headphones are probably better. If you have headphones, then you should probably grab them. If you're not listening on like studio monitors or something. If you're listening on studio monitors, that can work fine. Although headphones, the effects are a little bit more exaggerated because it's the first type or the first definition of stereo, where there's no crossover between the two speakers. So we'll talk a little bit more about panning, which is the simplest form of stereo. So what you can do in your DAW, which we have open here, is you can just, if we listen to the signal here, this is the normal signal that we have, just a normal saw wave, nothing new. What we can do is we can use this pan knob to either pan it right or left. So that's right panning, you will only hear it in the right ear, and this is left panning. Now you can set amounts, so for example I can set this to a little bit of a higher amount, let's say that to 25, and it will still play a little bit in the right ear, but a lot more in the left ear. You can also see that on the meter here. If you look at the meter, there's a meter for left and then there's a meter for right, and you can see that there's a difference in volume between them. Now something strange with panning in most DAWs is that it actually slightly increases the volume. So normally what you would expect if you're not panning anything is that here we have a signal that goes to 0. As you can see, it's slightly clipping here, but that's just because there's a little click there. The actual signal itself is going to 0, as you can see on this meter here. But in the left and the right channel, if we combine these two, which you expect would result in the same signal if both of these are outputting 0, which they are, you can see down here in this meter that they're outputting both at 0 as well. But after the panning, if we put them together, you can see that it's slightly more. You can see that here with the panning meters as well, that they're slightly higher than 0, even the signal itself, not just that little click at the end. So that's something to take into consideration. The reason why this is because most DAWs kind of compensate for the volume loss that you get when you're just turning down one channel completely, because that's really what panning is. You're turning down the volume of one of the channels so that the other one becomes more prominent. And to counteract that loss of volume, most DAWs compensate a little bit so that the volume to human ears kind of stays the same. And that's why when summing these two together, you actually end up with a signal that's louder than if you were just to play a normal signal. So I talked about summing. I'll now quickly give a definition of summing again on the whiteboard. So now let's say you have multiple signals. Let's draw in another one. I'm going to draw the exact opposite, or at least trying to. I'm not that good of a drawer. And let's say you take these two signals. We have a measurement here that's going up a certain amount, and it's going down a certain amount as well. Now what happens if we play these two signals together through the same speaker? Well, it's going to play this sound, and it's going to play a pressure point. Let's say that this is 0.7. And it's going to try to produce a 0.7, but it also needs to play this. Let's say this is a 0.8, actually a minus 0.8, that would be. So what it's going to do is it's going to take these two signals, these two values of the signal, and it's going to sum them together to output a minus 0.1. And that's how you sum signals together. That's why it's called summing. It's basically taking all these measurements that you're making at the same position, and it's summing those values together and then playing the result of that summation. So with that definition of summing in mind, let's look at the setup that I have here. First of all, it's important to note when I open up Serum here that you can see we have two oscillators, and one is playing only on the left channel and the other is playing only on the right channel. That way we have two different signals which we can then sum. Now the summing is done here with this utility, and it's done with this width knob, which is set to 0. Now what that means is that it's going to take the left channel and the right channel and then sum them together, and then it will take the result of that summing and output them on both channels. So it will basically sum them together into both channels. It will take the right channel and sum it with the left channel and output that result on the left channel and vice versa. So if we look at this oscillator setup, what we've done is we've done something with the phase here. You can see these modulations. Before I can explain what those modulations are going to do, I need to quickly explain what the phase of a signal is. The phase of a signal basically indicates its starting point. So if we click on this line, as you can see, we have 180 degrees, which means that it's halfway in. 360 degrees would be a full rotation of this signal. So phase is measured in degrees, which is a little bit of a weird measurement, but that's because it's a measurement that is independent of the length of the signal. If you have oscillations, obviously. So this is a limited length signal, and the degrees will just change where that signal starts, basically. So let me set this back to 180. Now, what will happen with these modulations that I've set up through this macro is that it will take the phase of one and slide it all the way down to this middle point here, which is the lowest point that it can go. And the other is going to go all the way up to the highest point that it will go. So now let's listen to what happens if we turn up that modulation. Again, headphones for this is the best way to hear this. You can hear that the volume completely reduces to 0. And that's because this is an opposite now of this. Whereas this starts at the high point, this one starts at the low point. And they're both crossing over and basically continuing to be the same signal from here. So it's still playing, it's just not getting any output because it's summing together to 0. Now, a different example is that with saw waves. And here we can see one of the properties that a wave needs to have for this to work is that it needs to be symmetrical, that it needs to flip. So if we listen to the saw waves doing the same thing, and we turn on the utility, we have the exact same setup, only with saw waves. And what happens here is it actually turns up an octave. And that's because when you sum this point, which is the highest point, together with this point, it's going to go up again. It's not going to cancel out because this is not the exact opposite. What you basically need to see when we look at this phase is that we have one point, take one point, and then you take half a cycle further into the wave cycle, and you're going to sum those two together. So that's what we're doing with this modulation. That's how it's set up. So what happens is, let's say we take this point is playing, then halfway through, this point is playing, and it's going to sum those together and it's going to go up again. So basically it's doubling the octave by doing this. And that's a very cool difference between the different waveforms that you can hear. So now that we know all of this, let's look at what a mono and a stereo signal actually is in the digital audio world. So when we talk about the stereo signal, what it basically means is the difference between the left and the right channel. So you have the two signals and you might sum them together and you get a difference. The reason why this trick works is because we're taking away all the stereo signal. The trick that I showed before with the sine waves summing together and cancelling each other out. If we actually don't do that, you can hear what's really going on is that the left channel is creating a different sound than the right channel. It's the exact opposite. Where here it's lower, it's higher here, because of obviously the difference in phase. So now let's listen to what that sounds like in here. This is a completely stereo sound. If you have a mono speaker, you shouldn't be able to hear anything. That's again why I recommend using headphones. Now we're hearing a completely stereo sound. And we'll also do that for the saw wave so that you can hear what a saw wave sounds like in stereo as well. So again, if we turn this off, you won't get the double octave anymore. We'll just get a stereo saw wave. Which also means that you can toggle on and off that extra octave that you get and turn that stereo saw wave into a mono saw wave that's 1 octave higher. Because again, it changes between summing those differences together or summing those channels together and taking the difference between those channels. So now that we know what a stereo signal is, let's actually look at how you can generate stereo signals. The very easiest way to induce a difference in the left and the right channel is through panning, because that's literally changing the volume of one of the channels to make the other channel louder. So let's actually look at that. Here I have a setup with just a simple string loop, and it sounds like this. And what we can do with panning is just set the balance here, which now starts in center, which means both channels have the equal volume. You can set that slightly to the left. Let's set it to like 30. You can now clearly hear that it's more in the left channel. And what panning is mainly used for is to place instruments in a virtual space. So you can imagine if you're sitting right in front of a stage and there's a violin playing on the exact left side of the stage, completely to the left side of the stage, that your left ear is going to pick that up louder than your right ear. So you can hear something like this. Now it's on the right, and now it's on the left again. So you can basically hear how by changing the pan, how it's just changing the placement of that virtual instrument on that virtual stage, on that virtual space that you have created. And it allows the listener to hear it coming from a certain direction, basically. The second way to add more stereo to a sound only really applies if the sound already has a little bit of stereo information. In that case, you can take the utility that we've previously used for summing, and you take that width knob that we've used to turn it mono, and you put it up above 100%, and in that case the sound actually becomes more stereo. So if we go in here, we use this to turn it into mono, but what we can also do is go the other way and turn it more stereo. What that will do is it will take those differences in the signal and it will boost them. So it will set every measurement of the two signals further apart, creating more difference in between the two signals, and therefore creating more stereo information. And this one goes up to 400%, which means that it's really going to boost the volume of the stereo information. It's actually just going to boost the gain of that as well, which result in a very wide, very stereo kind of feeling. You can see in the meters here that it's actually turning up the signal as well in loudness. It's actually clipping the sound quite a lot at 400%, as you can see here from the meters. So that's something to take into consideration if you're actually using this technique. A quick side note, I just mentioned the wide and wideness. What we mean by that is the wider a sound is, the more stereo it is. That's just the terminology we use because stereo sounds tend to sound like they're coming from here, whereas mono sounds tend to sound like they're coming from here. So the wider something is, the more stereo sound it has. So now let's look at the first little bit more advanced way of creating stereo that's actually used often. Let's say you have a mono sound source here, which we have. We've made that completely mono again with this utility. And it sounds like this. It's just a bass line. A nice bass line, as you can hear. But if we now look at this setup here, what I've done is I've added a simple delay effect here. And what we're doing is we're taking one of the channels, the right channel in this case, and we're just slightly delaying it more than the left channel. And as you can see, we have the dry wet 200 and we have no feedback. So this is called the Haas effect, and it's called that reason because Haas was one of the people who discovered this, or I think he might have been the only person who discovered it. I'm not quite sure, but that's not really important right now. What is important is what he discovered. And basically, if we zoom in to the signal, you can see that there's a lot of dips here and a lot of small differences between those signals. So what he decided to do is, let's say I take this dip and instead of playing it right next to it, I play it a little bit later. You're effectively creating a difference in the left and the right channel, even though before it was mono, which again, here it is because of that utility. So what he is doing is he's delaying one of these channels. Imagine that you have a left channel here and a right channel here. He's basically just shifting that backwards a little bit so that there's always a difference between this part and this part. There's a few negatives to that. For example, in the case that I showed you, if you go up very rapidly, it might actually cancel out, which can change some of the tone. But it also kind of gives a nice tone sometimes, and it sometimes can really work to create a nice stereo effect. So let's actually listen to it in this case. Now, one of the key ways that the Haas effect works is it doesn't change the volumes of the individual tracks, because it only changes the timing of the individual tracks. There's no change in volume between the two tracks, which it kind of sounded a little bit weird. For me, it sounded like it was definitely coming more from my left ear than from my right ear, but you can actually confirm that it isn't by looking at the meters again. You see, they both have the same volume. Another way you can make a change in the left and the right channel is if you slightly detune them from each other. A little while back, what I did is I showed you a patch where we made something a little bit more stereo. What we've basically done is use this trick of detuning many different sounds together and then playing one in the left ear and one in the right ear. So let's look at the mono sound source that we have, which again is made mono here. And now we have two versions where I've slightly detuned them. So again, on the channel itself, it's completely mono. What we've done is we've taken one to the right and one to the left. So what we've done here is we have one which has a pitch of plus 20 cents, which are very small increments in pitch. We're talking about a very small detuning here. And then we have one which is minus 21, but that can also be minus 20. And that gives an effect that sounds like this. Now this effect is a little bit different from the timing. The timing generally stays the same a lot more, depending on if you're warping things or not, or if you're the actual way you're doing the pitching. I can go in deep into warping and stuff like that, but that's not necessary for this video. We are warping at this current time, so that means that the timings stay the same due to the way Ableton handles these audio files. But what you will hear is that both the left and the right channel sound equally loud, whereas with that last example, at least for me, it sounded definitely like it was coming from the left ear more than the right ear. So that's the difference that in the two approaches, which result in a different kind of feeling. You can see that there's differences in volume here. So you might see that the volume is not consistent between the two. Not like with the Haas effect, where the volume is completely consistent between the two, because we're essentially playing different audio files at this point. We're playing two different signals which are pitched instead of just transposed in time. The next effect that I want to go over is a little bit of a difficult one, and I'm trying to explain it in the best I can. But first I'm going to let you listen to the dry signal that we have. Again, it's completely mono. And here we have the stereo version of that. And if we look at this channel, what has happened is we have applied a very small delay on that with a very small feedback. But the feedback here is, or the delay here is ping pong. So it will play alternatively between left and right ear, which creates a stereo effect because that creates a difference between the channel. And if we put it a little bit slower, you can actually hear what it's doing. So let's listen to that first. You can hear how it's kind of panning between the left and the right. Now, if I put this back to sync and set a lower time, you can also hear that. And we're going to gradually turn this knob down, making it faster and faster. Let me put this as a fade mode so that it doesn't re-pitch the sound. So here you can hear that it kind of does it in a different way. This version is very mono-compatible because we don't have a 100% wet effect on it. So you can really tune in how stereo you want it using the dry wet. If you want it completely stereo like this, or less, slightly stereo. Now this is very useful to help with mono-compatibility. What mono-compatibility is the measurement of how well something plays in mono. If you have too much stereo in your sounds, what will happen is it will cancel each other out because when it's summed to mono, it will obviously take those differences and cancel them out, like we saw with the sine wave example. And in the case of the sine wave, we had a complete difference, so they would cancel out to silence. That's the worst case scenario that you can have. But there might be like scenarios where it's only slightly canceling, and then a mix that works in stereo will not work in mono because it's cancelling out and just basically turning the volume down of that particular sound that way if it's too stereo. So this can really help dial in the amount of stereo that you want, and this way you get a little bit more control over how wide you want your signal to be. So now we're going to look at stereo generation plugins. These are dedicated plugins that are used to take a mono signal and turn them into a stereo sound. And I have two different plugins lined up for us. And we're going to discuss them a little bit. So let's look at that. So here again, we have the mono signal, which is in this case a violin sound. And here there's two different stereo plugins. Now I've chosen two because there's several different algorithms that can be used to generate stereo. In this case, we have one where noise is introduced in the signals, and they're stereo generated that way. And there's also a way using comb filters, where different comb filters are used on the left and the right channel to create a stereo effect. Here you can also hear kind of a reverb feeling. I've exaggerated both effects very, very far, so you can really hear what they're doing. But in this case, what you can hear is that there's also a little bit of reverb in there. It's also kind of placing it a little bit more in a room. And this is using kind of noise-based algorithm, I believe. I'm not 100% sure on that, but that's looking into it, that seems what is happening there. That it's some noise, combination of adding noise and as well as some other effects. Again, it sounds like a little bit of reverb in there as well, but that's on very extreme settings. Now let's look at this plugin, which is stereo spread instead of stereo generator, which we were looking at before. And this is using comb filters, so this sounds like this. So you can hear it's a different tone, and for me personally, I always like to work with a few different stereo generator types because they generally change the tone of your sound. And there are some that just sound better on different sounds than others. There's no one single stereo with plugin that's going to sound the best on all sounds. So I definitely use multiple different stereo plugins in my daily workflow. Next, I want to talk about using the dimension expander as well as reverb. Now these are both plugins or tools that are often used to put something into a room and make it sound like it's actually being recorded in a room. So here we have a very dry cello session that's also from a sample pack here. And let's take a listen to that. Now obviously this is made mono again, so we're going to use the dimension expander to turn it into a stereo sound. Now notice that there's a little bit of reverb on the original, but notice how this sounds a lot more in a room than the other one. I'm quickly going to flip between the two so you can listen. The dimension expander version also sounds like it's placed actually in a physical space a lot more. Here with the third one, it's going to be even clearer because this is an actual reverb. And it sounds like this. You can hear that it really sounds like it's recorded in, you know, in a room, as opposed to the original one. So that's what a dimension expander and reverb do to a signal to create a stereo signal from it. So we've talked about how you can generate stereo, but we haven't really talked about how you can see what's going on. Personally, I am very much a fan of looking at what I'm producing, so I like to use analyzers. So I now want to introduce you to an analyzer that I use all the time to check what a sound is doing in the stereo field. So here we have Stereoscope, which is a stereo analyzer. The main window that you want to look at is this little window here. I'm first going to play a mono signal through it, and then we'll kind of talk about what's happening. You can see a red line starting to appear right there in the center. Now this means, if we look at this red line, that this is the mono line, basically. You can see that we have a line which is labeled with an L and a line which is labeled with an R. One is obviously for the left channel and the other is for the right channel. You can basically look at it in the sense that the left channel is played over here and the right channel is played over here, and then those values are like summed together. So right here, let's say your maximum left channel, what you will see is that it goes all the way up here, and then the point will be represented here. So if we look at the left channel here, let's look at that. You can see the line is played over the left channel, and you can basically think of it as these maximums are pointed here, these minimums are pointed down below, and basically the signal is represented over that line that way. And the same for the right channel. So those two channels are then summed together, which means that a high point here and a high point here are going to land exactly in the middle there, basically on the mono line. So again, if we look at the mono line, what it's telling us is that stuff that is on this line is mono. That also means that if something is very close to this line, that it's very close to mono. There are very small differences between the left and the right channel. Whereas the further you get away from it, it's more different and therefore more stereo. The stereo line is actually not shown on this particular analyzer, but it does exist, and that's the horizontal line. So you can imagine what that means. If you have a maximum left and a minimum right, those two will completely cancel out, and they'll fall right in the middle on the horizontal line, also going through this point. So you can imagine another line here, which is the stereo line. Any completely stereo information will show up there, and anything that is close to that line will actually be considered to be very stereo. So here we have a stereo signal. Let's actually look at what that sounds like. I'm going to select that, and we'll see what that looks like here. You can both hear that it's stereo as well as see it on the line, on the horizontal line that's created. So these analyzers are very important because they show you exactly what's going on, and they'll show you how your sound is working in the stereo field, how it's sitting in there. And it's very useful to know that kind of information so that you can actually process them in the right way to put them into the stereo field. So now let's talk a little bit about how you would do that. Alright, so the simplest way to control stereo is with the width knob, which we've already discussed before. Here you can find it on utility, but there's definitely loads of effects or plugins that have this kind of knob. And it's just used to make a sound wider or thinner, basically. You can hear it's very mono now. And now we're going to go into stereo. and we're going to go into mono again. So that's the easiest way of controlling your stereo field. It's not very versatile, so now let's look at a little bit more of a versatile way of controlling it using a multiband processor. So here we have a multiband processor, and the very first thing, again, we'll listen to the normal stereo synth that we have. And what you can see here is a stereo processor. So you can see that we have these 4 bands, as well as these 4 widening knobs, and you can actually use that to make it completely mono, or set percentages, or make it completely stereo, which is 200% in this case. And what you can do is you can just set up a basic stereo field for each of the frequencies, and then you can play with the frequencies here, like this for example, and now you have a little bit more control over the stereo field. You can hear that we have set up a very weird setup here. We have the lowest frequencies being mono, the middle frequencies being mono, and these lower mids and high frequencies being completely stereo. That's definitely a weird setup, but that's something you can do with this kind of setup very easily. Now normally you wouldn't use that kind of stereo field. What you would use is something called a reverse pyramid, or what I like to call a reverse pyramid. And that's generally something like this. Here you can see that the lower the frequencies, the more mono they tend to be. Now this isn't a golden rule or anything, but it does really help by setting up kind of the way you want it to be. So this is what the synths sound like with the reverse pyramid. You can hear in this case the low end is a little bit thinner and the high end is a little bit wider, so that's a little bit more of a natural sound there. So I want to go on a quick little tangent here. We've talked about the 2-channel system here, but there's something else that you can do. You can add more channels. For example, if you look at a surround sound system, what that means is that there's more speakers. There's generally 2 in the front, 2 in the back, and 1 right in front of you, and that way they can place it instead of one axis where it's left to right, they can also put it forwards and backwards. They can make the sound like it's coming forwards or backwards from you. I have a little bit of an example that works with headphones, although it's not surround. There are these plugins through Creative signal processing can kind of simulate that kind of effect. So here I have a plugin called Dear Reality, which simulates that effect. But it sounds like this. Now we are in the right, now we are behind us, left, and in front of us again. It also covers elevation. It sounds above us, sounds below us. And on headphones that's a really convincing effect. I don't exactly know how they're doing it, but this is something you can look into if you want to use this kind of thing. Obviously, if you're working with surround sound audio, which not many of you are going to be, then it's easier. You're going to get more knobs to determine the front and the back, or higher or lower position as well, depending on what kind of speaker setup that you're working with. But something like surround sound or Dolby Atmos or those kind of systems can just handle that. So you'll be able to just mix in those systems, and you'll have knobs kind of like you have panning knobs here, but for how high you want the sound to be, how far in front or behind the listener you want the sound to be. So that's a little bit of a tangent that I thought was interesting. But now let's get back into some actual stereo stuff. So I want to talk about how you can actually use all this information about the stereo field and apply it to your sound design. And the very first example is separation of layers. So here I have two layers towards the sound. The sound sounds like this. Nice aggressive synth, but you cannot really tell the layers apart. What we can do is we can take this second layer here and apply a stereo width to that. And now it sounds like. So now we have a mono layer and we have a stereo layer. And that way you can kind of separate the 2 layers, and you can definitely hear that one is different from the other. For the second example of using stereo, I have a little bit more of a complex setup. You can see we have Omnisphere here generating a sound for us, which is 1 of 3. And then we have this rack making it like more mono, just so that we can work with it. And then we have this rack here, which again has a stereo widening tool or stereo widening plugin, It also has these other tools. And what these other tools do together is they make sure that the sound coming in and the sound coming out have the same volume. So that's very important for this trick to work. So that's why this setup is a little bit more complex. So this is what we have right now. And what we can use stereo with here for is to put that sound a little bit more in the background. So this is the sound that we have. So that's very stereo. And now if we turn that off, it's going to be a little bit more in your face. You can hear that it sits smack dab in the middle of where you're listening to. And with the stereo width, especially if we turn it up to a little bit more of an extreme setting, which I'm doing right now, you can hear it kind of gets back in the background a little bit more. It allows the other elements to come through a little bit more. You can hear them a little bit better in the mix, and it just turns them into the background. Now keep in mind, this is because we're also turning down the volume slightly. In this case, I believe it's 2.7 or 2.8 decibels. Or now it's a little bit more because we have set up different settings than we had before. But that way, what it's doing is it's compensating for the increase in gain that we get from basically turning it up so wide. So that's why I have this sender receiver here, which is balancing the volume. So you can really hear that effect of it coming more in the background without being affected by the actual volume change. Now the last one isn't really a use, it tends to be more of a side effect, and that is that it changes the tone, which I already talked about when choosing different stereo widening plugins. So if we listen to this tone right now, which is a normal monotone, if we apply a stereo width, it's going to slightly change the way the tone feels and the way it sounds as well. Not just that it's stereo, but also that it just has a little bit of a different character to it. As you can hear, definitely when it starts and stops, you can hear that it kind of has this zoop kind of effect towards the end of it. And that's definitely something that you don't hear when it's off. So that's everything I wanted to talk about that has to do with stereo. If you like this kind of content, then definitely let me know by leaving a like. It's been really difficult kind of producing this and seeing if this is going to work. I have been recording now for well over an hour. So yeah, it's a little bit of a different thing. It's a little bit harder for me to do. I can make these videos, but it means that I spend a little bit more time recording to hopefully get a better video in terms of quality, in terms of the topics covered, in terms of how I explain things. So let me know what you think by leaving a like, leaving a comment, sharing it on social media, sharing it with friends, whatever. And I hope to see you in the next video. Thank you for watching and see you next time.